January 17, 1943. Rabaul, New Britain. ****. The air over Simpson Harbor hung thick with smoke and salt. A young Kokutai pilot named Takashi Yamada sat cross-legged on the volcanic earth outside his tent, hands trembling as he held a cup of cold tea. His Zero fighter, tail number A1-154, stood silent on the coral airstrip behind him, riddled with bullet holes from a skirmish over the Solomon Sea 3 days prior. He had survived. 22 of his squadron had not. In the distance, the dull rhythm of American B-17s returning to their base in Guadalcanal echoed like distant thunder. Yamada did not look up. He stared instead at the cup, at the way the liquid trembled in rhythm with his pulse, and wondered when the trembling had begun, when his hands had started to betray the iron discipline drilled into him since boyhood. Across the harbor, inside a captured Australian barracks now repurposed as a Japanese intelligence post, a shortwave radio crackled to life. The operator, a young ensign named Hiroshi Tanaka, adjusted the dial with practiced patience, moving through frequencies clouded with static, coded transmissions, and the occasional burst of Morse. Then something stopped him. Not an order. Not a code. Music. A clarinet, sliding through notes with a lazy, rebellious ease, followed by a double bass that walked beneath it like a prowling cat. Then a trumpet, bright, brash, utterly unburdened. Tanaka froze. His hand hovered over the dial, but he did not turn it. Behind him, 3 other men looked up from their reports. No one spoke. The music filled the small, humid room like an uninvited guest. It was Duke Ellington. "Take the A-Train." Broadcasting live from a United States Armed Forces radio service transmission, beamed across the Pacific from a station in Brisbane, meant to reach American servicemen scattered across 1,000 islands. But radio waves do not respect borders. They slip through the atmosphere, indifferent to war, indifferent to allegiance. And so the enemy listened. For Yamada, for Tanaka, for thousands of Japanese soldiers and airmen scattered across the bruised archipelagos of the South Pacific, this was the first time they heard it. Jazz. American jazz. Not propaganda. Not martial hymns or orchestral grandeur designed to stir the soul toward sacrifice. This was something else entirely, something they had no reference for, no vocabulary to describe. In the Showa military doctrine that had shaped their youth, music served the state. It was vertical, hierarchical. It moved in formation. But this moved like water, like laughter, like a conversation between instruments that interrupted one another, teased, and somehow resolved into coherence without a conductor's baton to command it. It was chaos that organized itself. Freedom that did not collapse. Tanaka would later write in a letter never sent, found decades afterward in a humid archive in Yokohama. "I did not understand it, but I felt it. It was as if the music was speaking to a part of me I had been taught to kill." This is not a story about music. It is a story about ideology meeting reality. About the moment when the edifice of belief, carefully constructed, ruthlessly maintained, encounters something it cannot explain. For the men of the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces, the war in the Pacific was more than territorial. It was civilizational. They had been told, and they believed, that the West was decadent, spiritually hollow, a culture of individualism and materialism that had lost its soul. America, in particular, was portrayed as a mongrel nation, racially impure, gluttonous, lazy, a giant grown fat on stolen wealth, incapable of sacrifice, destined to shatter at the first real blow. This was the narrative that justified the war. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was not merely conquest, it was salvation. Japan would free Asia from the corrupt embrace of the white colonizers and, in doing so, restore a natural order rooted in discipline, purity, and collective will. The early months of the war seemed to confirm this. Pearl Harbor, the fall of Singapore, the humiliation of the British at Hong Kong, the Dutch at Java, the Americans at Bataan. Japanese forces swept southward with a speed and ferocity that stunned the world. For the soldiers and pilots who carried out these victories, there was a euphoria, a vindication. They were the cutting edge of history. The enemy crumbled. The enemy fled. The West, they believed, had been exposed as a paper tiger, and Japan had lit the match. But by 1943, the tide had turned. Midway had broken the back of the carrier fleet. Guadalcanal had become a meat grinder, consuming men and material in a jungle nightmare that no one had anticipated. The Americans, it turned out, did not shatter. They did not collapse. They adapted. And worse, much worse, they brought with them an abundance that defied comprehension. Yamada had seen it firsthand. In November of 1942, his squadron had strafed an American supply convoy off the coast of Bougainville. They scored hits, 2 transports smoking, listing, but as his Zero pulled away, he looked down at the water and saw crates. Hundreds of crates, spilling from the ruptured hulls, floating on the surface like a sprawling jigsaw. Even in destruction, the Americans left behind wealth. He thought of his own rations, a small tin of rice, a strip of dried fish, a knot of seaweed. He thought of the mechanics on Rabaul, who patched Zeros with scavenged aluminum because new parts had stopped arriving months ago. And he thought of those crates, drifting away, unclaimed. When captured American positions were overrun, Japanese soldiers found things that did not make sense. Entire tents stocked with cigarettes, canned fruit, chocolate bars, coffee, fresh bread. One infantry unit occupying an abandoned marine camp on Guadalcanal discovered a field kitchen still stocked with eggs, butter, and bacon. The men stood in stunned silence. Eggs. Fresh eggs. Some wept. Others laughed in disbelief. They had not seen eggs in a year. The contrast was obscene. It was not merely abundance, it was indifference to scarcity. The Americans fought as if supply was infinite, as if the war was an inconvenience rather than an existential struggle. This was the cognitive dissonance that jazz would deepen. The music was not incidental. It was evidence. Evidence that the narrative they had been given was incomplete, possibly a lie. Because how could a decadent, soulless people produce something like this? How could a nation of individualists, pulling in selfish directions, generate a sound so coherent, so intricate, so alive? The imperial propaganda machine had no answer. It had not prepared them for this. There is a documented account from a Japanese army officer, Captain Sakai Yoshiro, stationed in the Marshall Islands in early 1943. He kept a diary, written in cramped script on the margins of requisition forms. An entry from February reads, **, last night the radio operator tuned into an American frequency. Music. Not like ours. Not like anything. I ordered him to turn it off, but I did not move. I listened. It made me angry, though I do not know why. Perhaps because it sounded like joy. We have forgotten what that sounds like. Joy. That was the weapon they had not anticipated. Not the Corsairs or the Shermans or the endless supply chain, though those mattered, certainly. But joy. The sound of a people who, even in war, had not abandoned pleasure. Who packed record players alongside ammunition. Who built airstrips and then, inexplicably, built bandstands beside them. Who treated music not as a tool of the state but as a right, as fundamental as food or speech. For the men of the imperial forces, raised in a culture where self-denial was virtue and suffering was honor, this was incomprehensible. The Bushido code that framed their existence demanded the suppression of the self in service to the emperor, the nation, the collective will. Personal desire was weakness. Comfort was corruption. A soldier who sought joy was a soldier who had failed. And yet here was an enemy who seemed to do both, who fought with ferocity and then sat down afterward to play a trumpet, to laugh, to dance. It violated the rules. It suggested that discipline and joy were not opposites, that a man could be free and still be strong. The radio transmissions continued. Night after night, American frequencies bled into Japanese receivers. Sometimes it was live performances from rear area bases, swing bands made up of servicemen who, before the war, had been clerks and farmhands and factory workers. Sometimes it was recorded broadcasts shipped from the States, voices of Benny Goodman, Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday. The Japanese operators were supposed to report these frequencies, to shut them down or jam them. Many did not. They listened. In the Solomon Islands, on Truk, on Saipan, in the caves of Iwo Jima, men who had been taught to despise the enemy found themselves leaning closer to the static, straining to hear. There is no singular record of Japanese soldiers weeping upon hearing jazz for the first time, but the historical fragments suggest a pattern. Letters, diaries, testimonies taken after surrender. A recurring theme, confusion, anger, and then something softer. A breaking, not of will, but of certainty. One soldier, a private named Kenji Watanabe, captured on Peleliu in late 1944, told his American interrogators through a translator, "We were told you had no culture, that you were barbarians. But I heard your music. I did not understand it, but I knew we had been lied to." The tears, when they came, were not for the music itself. They were for what the music represented. The collapse of a worldview. The realization that the enemy was not what they had been promised. That the Americans were not weak, not soulless, not on the verge of collapse. That they were, in fact, terrifyingly whole. They could build ships faster than Japan could sink them. They could feed armies across oceans while Japanese soldiers starved on jungle islands. And they could do all of this while playing music that moved the soul. There is a symbolic object that recurs in the testimonies of those who survived the Pacific War, and it is not a weapon. It is a record. A vinyl record. Captured from American positions, smuggled, hidden, played in secret on gramophones looted from colonial homes. These records became talismans, dangerous contraband. To possess one was to court punishment. Officers feared the music would erode morale, would plant seeds of doubt. They were right to fear. The music did erode. Not morale in the traditional sense, but the narrative. It offered a glimpse of an alternative reality, a world where the individual was not erased but celebrated, where improvisation, the very act of making something new without orders, was not treasonous but sacred. By 1944, the war was lost, though the dying would continue for another year. Japanese forces, isolated on bypassed islands, starving, diseased, bombed relentlessly from the air, clung to what remained of their faith. Some still believed in victory. Others believed in honorable death. But there were those, particularly among the younger men who had grown up with some exposure to Western culture before the militarists tightened their grip, who simply believed less. They had heard the music. They had tasted the captured rations. They had seen the photographs taken from dead Marines, smiling men, arms around one another, no fear in their eyes, no shame. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. One of the most haunting accounts comes from a naval officer, Lieutenant Nakamura Toshio, who survived the sinking of his destroyer off Leyte Gulf. He was pulled from the water by an American submarine, expecting execution. Instead, he was given a blanket, hot coffee, and a meal. After he ate, a sailor brought him below decks and played him a record. Ella Fitzgerald. How High the Moon. Nakamura sat in silence, salt water still drying on his skin, and listened. Decades later, in an interview recorded in the 1980s, he said, "I wept. I do not know why. Perhaps because I was alive. Perhaps because the music was beautiful. Perhaps because I realized I had been wrong about them, and that being wrong had cost me everything." The jazz the Japanese soldiers heard was not, strictly speaking, propaganda. It was not designed to demoralize the enemy. The Armed Forces radio service broadcasts were intended for American troops, to remind them of home, to keep morale high, to give them a reason to fight. But the unintended consequence was perhaps more powerful. The broadcasts were proof of the society they represented, a society so confident, so materially and spiritually abundant, that it could afford to send music into a war zone. That it could treat art not as a luxury to be suspended in crisis, but as a necessity, as essential as ammunition. In Tokyo, the militarist government understood this, even if they could not articulate it. As the war dragged on and the losses mounted, Japanese propaganda became more shrill, more desperate. The Americans were depicted as demons, as subhuman monsters who tortured prisoners and desecrated the dead. Some of this was projection. Japanese forces had committed atrocities in China, in the Philippines, in countless villages whose names would be forgotten. But some of it was fear. Fear that the rank and file would realize what some had already begun to suspect, that the enemy was not the monster they had been promised. That the enemy was, in some ways, more human, and that this humanity was not weakness but strength. The symbolic power of jazz in this context cannot be overstated. Jazz was born in America, but it was born from suffering, from the black experience, from slavery, from segregation, from the long, brutal struggle for dignity in a society that denied it. It was the music of people who had been told they were less, who had been subjugated, and who had responded not with silence but with art, with innovation, with a sound that could not be contained. And in the 1940s, that music had been adopted, imperfectly, problematically, but undeniably, by the broader American culture. It played in nightclubs in Harlem and ballrooms in Los Angeles. It played on the radio. It played in the barracks and on the battlefields. It was the sound of America, messy and contradictory and alive. For Japanese soldiers, who had been raised in a monoculture, who had been taught that racial purity and national unity were the sources of strength, the implications were staggering. Here was a nation that was not pure, that was a chaotic mix of races and religions and languages, and yet it was winning, not just militarily. Culturally, spiritually. The jazz suggested that diversity was not weakness. That freedom, messy, unruly, undisciplined freedom, could coexist with power. This was the ideological nightmare that kept the militarists awake at night. Because if it was true, then everything they had built was a lie. The tears, then. The tears were for the lie. For the years spent in service to a vision that was crumbling, for the friends who had died believing, for the certainty that had been the only comfort in the midst of horror, now stripped away. The tears were for the realization that the enemy did not need to be monsters to defeat you. They could be human. They could play music. They could laugh and fight and win, all at once. And if they could do that, what did it mean to be Japanese? What did it mean to have sacrificed everything for a cause that had misread the world so fundamentally? There is a recording, preserved in the National Archives in Washington, of an Armed Forces radio broadcast from April 1945. The host, a sergeant from Chicago, introduces a set by the Glenn Miller Orchestra, recorded before Miller's disappearance over the English Channel. The sergeant's voice is warm, conversational, utterly unburdened by the weight of history. He jokes about the heat in the Pacific, thanks the listeners, and then the music plays. In the Mood. A song so ebullient, so relentlessly optimistic that it borders on defiance. Somewhere, on some island, a Japanese soldier with access to a radio heard this. We do not know his name. We do not know if he survived. But the broadcast went out, and the music traveled, and it landed in ears that had been trained to hate. By the time the war ended in August 1945, Japan was a ruin. Cities incinerated. The economy shattered. The military dissolved. The emperor, once a living god, reduced to a voice on the radio, admitting defeat. In the occupation that followed, American forces brought with them the machinery of reconstruction, food, medicine, infrastructure. But they also brought culture. Jazz clubs opened in Tokyo, in Osaka, in Yokohama. Japanese musicians, hungry for something new, for something that was not tainted by the militarist past, learned to play. They studied the records. They imitated the styles. And then, slowly, they made it their own. In the decades that followed, Japan would become one of the most passionate markets for jazz in the world. Japanese collectors would seek out rare pressings with a devotion that bordered on religious. Japanese musicians would master the form and then innovate within it, creating new subgenres, new fusions. The music that had once been the enemy's weapon became a shared language, a bridge. But for those who had heard it first in 1943, in a tent on Rabaul or a bunker on Saipan, the memory was more complicated. It was the sound of the moment when everything changed, when the narrative broke, when the certainty that had carried them into war dissolved, and they were left with only questions. There is a concept in Japanese aesthetics called mono no aware, the pathos of things, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence. It is the recognition that beauty and sorrow are inseparable, that the cherry blossoms are most beautiful precisely because they fall. In some way, jazz became a symbol of this for the generation that lived through the war. It was beautiful and it was painful because it represented what they had lost, not the war itself, but the illusion, the belief that their suffering had meaning, that their sacrifice was for something pure and true. The music said otherwise. It said that meaning could exist without purity, that beauty could emerge from chaos, that freedom, for all its messiness, was worth defending. In 1952, a former Zero pilot named Yamada Takashi, yes, the same man who sat trembling with a cup of tea on Rabaul in 1943, opened a small jazz club in the Ginza district of Tokyo. He called it the Blue Note, borrowing the name from the famous New York label. He did not play an instrument. He simply curated the music, selected the records, and listened. When asked by a journalist why he had chosen this path, he said, "I spent the war trying to destroy them. Now I spend my time trying to understand them. The music is where I begin." The club became a gathering place for veterans, for intellectuals, for young people hungry for a connection to the wider world. It was a place where former enemies sat side by side, where the boundaries of the past softened, where the notes of a saxophone could mean more than any treaty or declaration. Yamada kept a photograph on the wall behind the bar. It was a picture of AB-17, engine smoking, limping back to base after a bombing run. He never explained why he kept it, but those who knew him understood. It was a reminder, not of victory or defeat, but of the complexity of history, the way that the enemy can also be the teacher. This is what the music taught. That ideology, no matter how pure, how disciplined, how ruthlessly enforced, cannot survive contact with reality indefinitely. That human beings are more than the stories they are told about themselves, and that when the story breaks, they must either find a new one or be consumed by the void. The Japanese soldiers who wept upon hearing jazz for the first time wept because they had touched that void. They had seen the crack in the narrative. And through the crack, they had glimpsed something they were not supposed to see, that the enemy was not only strong but joyful, not only victorious but free, and that this combination was not a paradox but a truth. The war in the Pacific was won by steel and logistics, by aircraft carriers and atomic bombs, by the sheer industrial might of a nation that could outproduce its enemies 20-fold. But it was also won by the things that steel cannot measure, by the records shipped across oceans, by the broadcasts that slipped through the static, by the music that said, without words, that there was another way to live. That sacrifice need not mean annihilation of the self. That discipline could coexist with joy. That freedom, for all its chaos and contradiction, was not decadence but strength. In the years after the war, many Japanese intellectuals struggled to explain what had happened. How had the nation, so disciplined, so unified, so certain of its destiny, been defeated so utterly? Some pointed to material factors, resources, technology, the two-front war. Others pointed to strategic errors, to the hubris of the high command. But a few, a very few, pointed to something deeper, to the fact that the war had been fought not just on battlefields but in the realm of ideas, and that Japan had brought a rigid ideology into conflict with a flexible one. That the Americans, for all their flaws, and they were many, were deep, were unforgivable in their own contexts, had understood something fundamental, that a free people, allowed to think and create and argue and play, would ultimately outfight a controlled one. Not because they were better soldiers, but because they had something to return to. A life that was more than duty. A world that was more than war. The jazz was proof. It was the sound of that world, transmitted across the Pacific, indifferent to borders, indifferent to enmity. It played in the ears of men who had been taught to hate, and it made them weep, not because it was propaganda, but because it was true. Because truth, when it finally arrives, is often unbearable. It strips away the comfort of certainty and demands that you see the world as it is, not as you were told it should be. And for the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces, sitting in the ruins of their faith, listening to a trumpet solo that bent and soared and resolved in ways their training had never prepared them for, that truth was this: they had been lied to, and the lie had cost them everything, and the music was beautiful, and that beauty was the cruelest thing of all. In the end, the war ended. The music did not. It continued to play, in clubs and on records, in Tokyo and New York and everywhere in between. It became, in time, not a symbol of victory or defeat, but of something more enduring, of the human capacity to create beauty even in the midst of horror, of the way that art can cross boundaries that politics cannot, of the possibility that understanding, however painful, is the first step toward reconciliation. Yamada Takashi ran his club for 30 years. He died in 1982, a month before his 70th birthday. At his funeral, they played Duke Ellington, "Take the A-Train," the same song that had crackled through the radio on Rabaul in 1943, when he was a young pilot with trembling hands, when the world was on fire and the certainty of youth was beginning to crack. The mourners sat in silence and listened. Some of them had fought the war. Some had been born after it. But all of them heard, in the bright swinging notes, the same thing that Yamada had heard 40 years before, a sound that refused to be contained, a joy that refused to be extinguished, a freedom that could not be conquered. And in that sound there was a truth that outlasted the war, outlasted the empires, outlasted the men who fought and died believing. The truth that the human spirit, when given the space to breathe, will always find a way to sing. And that song, once heard, can never be fully forgotten. It echoes. It persists. It crosses oceans and generations. It reaches even into the ears of enemies, and it plants a seed. A small, dangerous, beautiful seed that whispers, "There is another way. There is another world. Listen."